There is a moment, rarely acknowledged, when a system reveals its fault lines before anything actually breaks. It is not loud. It does not announce itself. It simply exists as a quiet imbalance, a subtle distortion in the way attention flows, in who is seen and who remains just outside the light. Within the world of the X-Men, a world already defined by conflict, mutation, and survival under pressure, this imbalance does not emerge through war or ideology. It emerges through intimacy, through presence, through the fragile architecture of recognition. Scott Summers stands at the center of that architecture, not because he demands it, but because the structure of the world itself seems to require him there. He is not the most charismatic. He is not the most emotionally expressive. In many ways, he is the least flexible presence in a system that constantly demands adaptation. And yet, the entire formation stabilizes around him. Leadership adheres to him. Responsibility binds itself to him. And perhaps most significantly, expectation follows him like gravity. But gravity does not explain everything. It explains attraction. It does not explain fixation. Emma Frost understands this distinction better than anyone. She is not naive about power, nor about desire. She has built herself from the inside out, constructing an identity that functions as both weapon and shield, a carefully maintained surface that reflects strength while concealing vulnerability beneath layers of precision and control. In any other context, she would dominate the frame. She would define the terms of engagement. She would not compete for visibility. She would command it. And yet, in proximity to Scott Summers, something shifts. The frame does not respond to her in the way it should. The center does not move. The structure holds, but not around her. Around something else. Around someone else. Jean Grey is not present in the immediate sense. She does not occupy the same space, does not speak, does not act. And still she exerts influence. Not as a character moving through events, but as a fixed point in the symbolic landscape, a presence that cannot be displaced because it was never constructed as something that could be replaced. She is not simply remembered. She is embedded. This is where the imbalance begins to take shape. Not as rivalry in the conventional sense, not as direct opposition, but as a condition. Emma Frost is not competing with Jean Grey as an active counterpart. She is navigating a space already structured around an absence that behaves like a presence, a memory that functions not as recollection, but as standard, as measure, as silent reference. And Scott Summers, whether consciously or not, operates within that structure. His decisions, his attachments, his silences, all seem to orbit something that no longer exists in physical terms, but continues to define the emotional gravity of his world. He does not articulate this. He does not need to. The system reflects it for him. There is something unsettling about this kind of arrangement. It suggests that identity, at least within this context, is not entirely self-generated. It is distributed. It is influenced by echoes, by previous configurations that continue to shape current dynamics long after their visible components have disappeared. Emma Frost recognizes this immediately. She does not need it explained. She sees the pattern. She understands the structure. And more importantly, she understands what it means to enter a system that was never built for her, but one she chooses to inhabit anyway. This is not a position she is accustomed to. Not because she lacks the capacity to adapt, but because she rarely enters a space where her presence does not immediately reconfigure the hierarchy. She is used to being the one who defines the terms, who redraws the boundaries, who shifts the center simply by existing within it. But here the center resists, and that resistance is not external. It is not imposed by others. It is not even consciously maintained by Scott. It is structural. It is embedded in the way his attachments were formed, in the way his sense of loyalty, loss, and identity coalesced around Jean Grey long before Emma Frost entered the frame. What Emma encounters is not rejection. It is something more difficult to confront. indifference shaped by prior devotion. A system that is not hostile, but already complete in a way that leaves no obvious space for her to occupy without displacing something that cannot be displaced. This creates a unique form of tension, not one driven by conflict, but by misalignment. Emma Frost operates with clarity, with precision, with a deep understanding of both herself and the systems she enters. But here, her understanding does not grant her control. It only grants her awareness. She knows exactly what is happening, and knowing does not resolve it. There is a particular kind of frustration that emerges when someone recognizes the rules of a system but cannot alter them. It is not confusion. It is not ignorance. It is the opposite. It is clarity without leverage, insight without transformation. Emma Frost does not misunderstand Scott Summers. That would be simpler. She understands him too well. She sees what anchors him, what defines his emotional architecture, what limits his ability to fully reorient toward the present. And she sees with equal clarity that this limitation is not something he perceives as a limitation at all. For Scott, this is continuity. For Emma, it is constraint. The tension, then, is not about whether Emma Frost is enough. It is about whether the system she has entered allows for her to be recognized on her own terms. Whether visibility is something she can achieve, or something structurally denied to her by the persistence of a prior configuration that continues to dictate the present. This is where the conflict truly begins, not in confrontation but in orientation, in the question of where one stands within a system that has already decided, long before one arrived, what it values, what it remembers, and what it refuses to let go. Emma Frost stands within that system, fully aware of its mechanics, fully capable of navigating it, and yet, for perhaps the first time, uncertain of whether mastery is enough. Because this is not a battlefield. It is a structure, and structures do not yield easily. Before Emma Frost ever enters Scott Summers' orbit, the architecture of his inner world has already been constructed under pressure. Not gradually, not through ease, but through necessity. His identity does not emerge from exploration. It is forged through containment. From the beginning, he is defined by the need to regulate what cannot be allowed to surface unchecked. His power is not expressive. It is destructive unless controlled. That distinction matters. It means that his sense of self is built not around expansion, but around restraint. This creates a particular kind of psychological formation, one in which responsibility precedes desire, in which the individual learns, early and decisively, that what they are must be managed before it can be understood. Scott Summers does not grow into leadership. He is positioned into it by the logic of his own containment. The world does not simply ask him to lead. It requires him to maintain coherence in situations where chaos would otherwise prevail. And so, his emotional architecture mirrors this dynamic. He is precise, measured, oriented toward stability. His attachments are not fluid. They are anchored. Once established, they do not shift easily, because shifting would imply a loss of control, a reconfiguration of internal equilibrium that he has spent his entire life maintaining. Jean Grey enters this system not as a disruption, but as a completion. She does not challenge Scott's need for structure. She integrates with it. Her presence aligns with his internal logic, offering a form of balance that does not require him to abandon the framework he depends on. She understands him, not in opposition to his limitations, but through them. She does not ask him to become something else. She allows him to remain what he is, while expanding the range of what that can mean. This is why her presence becomes foundational, not because of idealization in the superficial sense, but because she occupies a position within his psychological system that no one else has occupied before or since. She is not interchangeable. She is structural. The relationship is not simply emotional. It is organizational. It defines how he relates to himself, to others, to the world. When that structure is disrupted, the disruption does not produce openness. It produces fixation. The absence does not create space. It reinforces the importance of what was lost. The system contracts around the memory, preserving it as a reference point that continues to guide behavior, perception, and attachment long after the original configuration has dissolved. Scott does not consciously choose to hold on. He does not need to. The system holds on for him. Emma Frost, by contrast, emerges from an entirely different formation. Where Scott is shaped by containment, Emma is shaped by exposure. Her early experiences do not teach her to regulate internal force. They teach her to defend against external intrusion. Power, for her, is not something to be controlled. It is something to be wielded, to establish distance, to maintain sovereignty over a world that has consistently attempted to reduce her to something less than autonomous. She does not build herself through restriction. She builds herself through assertion, through clarity, through a refusal to be defined by anything she does not explicitly choose. This results in a persona that is not merely protective, but declarative. She does not hide her strength. She amplifies it. She does not soften her edges. She sharpens them. But this construction comes at a cost. The armor that protects her also isolates her. Not completely. Not in a way that prevents connection altogether, but in a way that filters it, that ensures that any form of intimacy must pass through layers of scrutiny, control, and strategic positioning before it can reach something real. Emma Frost is not incapable of vulnerability. She is highly selective about when and where it is allowed to exist. This is where the contrast between her and Scott becomes critical. He is oriented toward stability through limitation. She is oriented toward stability through dominance. Both are structured. Both are controlled. But the direction of that control differs. One contains inward. The other projects outward. When Emma encounters Scott, she recognizes something immediately. Not weakness, not rigidity, but coherence. A form of internal consistency that she has rarely encountered. He is not performative in his restraint. He is not calculating in his moral positioning. He simply operates within a framework that he believes to be necessary, and he adheres to it without deviation. For Emma, this is not just attractive. It is disorienting, because it presents a form of power that does not resemble her own. A form that does not rely on dominance, on strategic advantage, on the constant negotiation of perception. It is quiet, stable, unyielding in a way that does not seek to assert itself, but simply exists as a constant. She sees in Scott something that cannot be easily manipulated, not because he is resistant, but because he is already aligned with a structure that defines his actions independently of external influence. This makes him both difficult to control and difficult to destabilize. And yet, it also makes him predictable. Not in a simplistic sense, but in a structural one. Emma understands that his attachments, once formed, will not shift easily. That his sense of loyalty is not conditional. That his emotional investments are not transient. This is not a flaw in her perception. It is an accurate reading of his internal system. What complicates this dynamic is not her misunderstanding of Scott, but her understanding of what that stability implies. It means that whatever existed before her will continue to exist within him, not as memory alone, but as active reference, as guiding principle, as silent comparison. Jean Grey, in this context, is not simply someone Scott loved. She is the configuration through which he understands what love is, and that configuration remains intact, even in her absence. Emma does not enter an open field. She enters a territory already occupied. This creates a layered tension that operates beneath the surface of their interactions. It is not expressed through overt conflict. It does not require confrontation to exist. It is embedded in the structure of their connection, in the way recognition is distributed, In the way presence is weighted against absence, Emma can stand beside Scott. She can engage with him. She can even connect with him on levels that are immediate, tangible, real. But there is always something else present, something that does not speak, does not act, and yet influences the shape of every interaction. She feels it, not as insecurity in the conventional sense, but as misalignment, as the awareness that the position she occupies is not fully her own, but partially defined by something that cannot be addressed directly because it is not actively participating in the exchange. This is where her frustration begins to take form, not because she lacks power or clarity or agency, but because she encounters a limit that her usual strategies cannot overcome. She cannot outmaneuver a memory. She cannot assert dominance over an absence. She cannot negotiate with something that exists outside the present moment, but continues to shape it. And more importantly, she cannot force Scott to recognize this as a problem, because for him, it is not. He does not perceive his attachment to Jean as something that interferes with his ability to form new connections. He experiences it as continuity, as loyalty, as integrity. The very qualities that Emma initially recognizes as strength become, from her perspective, points of friction. This is the paradox at the core of their dynamic. What draws her to him is also what prevents her from being fully seen by him. The same structural stability that makes him reliable, grounded, and coherent also makes him resistant to the kind of reconfiguration that would allow Emma to occupy the central position she is accustomed to holding. She is not competing with Jean Grey in the traditional sense. She is confronting the persistence of a system that was never designed to replace its foundational elements. And for the first time, Emma Frost finds herself in a position where her ability to understand a system does not grant her the ability to control it. That realization does not arrive all at once. It emerges gradually, through interaction, through observation, through the accumulation of small moments that reveal the underlying structure more clearly than any explicit declaration could. Each moment reinforces the same pattern. She is present, but she is not central. And in a world where she has always defined herself through presence, through visibility, through the capacity to shape perception and command attention, this becomes something more than a relational complication. It becomes a fracture in her own identity. Because if she cannot redefine the structure she has entered, then she must confront the possibility that there are systems in which her power, her clarity, her control are not enough to secure the position she has always assumed she could occupy. That possibility does not break her, but it changes the terms. And once those terms shift, the conflict is no longer external. It becomes internal. The transition from awareness to consequence does not occur through a single event. It unfolds through accumulation, through repetition, through the slow recognition that what initially appeared as a minor misalignment is, in fact, a structural condition that cannot be adjusted without cost. Emma Frost does not arrive at this realization in a moment of crisis. She arrives at it through continuity, through proximity, through the persistent experience of occupying a position that never fully stabilizes around her. At first, the dynamic appears manageable. Scott engages. He responds. He allows Emma into his operational world, into his strategic thinking, into the spaces where decisions are made and responsibilities are carried. There is trust there, and not the superficial kind. He relies on her judgment. He recognizes her intelligence. He does not dismiss her contributions. In many ways, he treats her as an equal in the domains that matter most to him. But equality in function does not translate to centrality in meaning. This distinction begins to sharpen over time. Emma notices it not through absence of attention, but through its distribution. Scott is present with her, yet part of his orientation always seems directed elsewhere. Not in distraction, not in disinterest, but in alignment with something that precedes her and continues to organize his emotional responses beneath the surface of their interactions. She does not misinterpret this. She maps it, and once mapped, it cannot be ignored. The first stage of the conflict, then, is not confrontation, but calibration. Emma adjusts her approach. Not dramatically, not in a way that would signal vulnerability or uncertainty, but through subtle shifts in how she positions herself within the relationship. She tests the boundaries of the structure she has entered. She probes for elasticity, for points where influence might reshape alignment, where presence might translate into permanence. She increases proximity, not physically but psychologically. She engages Scott in ways that extend beyond function, beyond shared responsibility, into domains that require personal recognition. She does not abandon her composure, but she allows glimpses of something beneath it, not fully exposed, never fully unguarded, but enough to register as an offering. Scott receives this. He does not reject it. He does not resist it, but he does not reorganize around it. This is the critical moment, not because of what happens, but because of what is not. Emma recognizes that engagement alone is insufficient, that access does not equate to integration, that even when she is fully present, fully engaged, fully aligned with him in the present moment, there remains a layer of his internal structure that does not shift in response to her. Jean Grey does not need to be invoked explicitly. She does not need to be mentioned. Her presence is encoded in the way Scott processes connection, in the standards he applies, in the unspoken comparisons that shape his perception without ever being articulated. Emma begins to feel the pressure of that comparison, not as something imposed externally, but as something embedded within the system itself. It is not that Scott actively measures her against Jean. It is that the framework through which he understands emotional connection was formed in relation to Jean, and that framework remains unchanged. This creates a form of rivalry that is fundamentally asymmetrical. Emma is operating in the present. She is engaging with Scott as he is now, as they are now. Jean exists as a fixed reference point, immune to change, immune to contradiction, immune to the kinds of friction that inevitably emerge in active relationships. Emma cannot compete with that, not because she lacks capacity, but because the terms of the comparison are inherently distorted. She is subject to time, to interaction, to the complexities of real engagement. Jean as a memory is not. She remains stable, preserved, untouched by the dynamics that would otherwise complicate perception. Emma understands this, and understanding does not neutralize its impact. The second stage of the conflict emerges from this recognition. If the system cannot be reshaped through integration, then it must be confronted through pressure. Not overtly, not aggressively, but strategically. Emma begins to assert herself more directly, not as a challenge to Scott, but as a redefinition of what their connection represents. She does not ask for recognition. She creates conditions that demand it. This shift is subtle but significant. Her interactions with Scott become more pointed, more precise in how they expose the underlying imbalance. She does not accuse him of holding on to Jean. She does not frame the issue as competition. Instead, she introduces moments that force the system to reveal itself more clearly. Moments where the absence becomes visible through its effects. Moments where the structure that resists her presence becomes undeniable. Scott begins to register this. Not fully, not in a way that leads to immediate recalibration, but enough to create tension. He senses the shift in Emma's approach. He recognizes that something has changed in how she engages with him, in the way she positions herself within the relationship. But his response remains consistent with his internal framework. He attempts to stabilize the situation without altering its foundation. He reassures without restructuring. He engages without redefining. From his perspective, this is resolution. From Emma's perspective, it is confirmation. The imbalance is not accidental. It is systemic. This realization does not produce immediate rupture. Emma does not withdraw. She does not disengage. Instead, she intensifies her presence, not in a way that compromises her identity, but in a way that tests the limits of the structure more aggressively. She occupies more space. She asserts more clearly. She refuses to remain peripheral in a system that she has the capacity to influence. But influence, she begins to understand, is not the same as transformation. The third stage of this development is where the tension becomes irreversible, not because of a singular event, but because of cumulative saturation. The system reaches a point where its internal contradictions can no longer be managed through adjustment alone. Emma has done everything that her framework allows. She has engaged, adapted, asserted, and tested. She has approached the situation with clarity, with strategy, with an understanding of both herself and Scott that leaves little room for misinterpretation. And still, the center does not move. This is where the fracture begins to form, not between them, but within Emma herself. Not as a collapse of identity, but as a destabilization of certainty. She has always operated under the assumption that understanding a system grants the ability to navigate and, ultimately, to control it. Here, that assumption fails. She understands the system completely, and she cannot change it. This is not a failure of perception. It is a limitation of agency within a structure that resists reconfiguration at its core. The rules are not negotiable. The foundation is not flexible. The presence of Jean Grey, as a symbolic anchor within Scott's internal world, cannot be displaced through engagement alone. Emma is forced to confront a possibility that runs counter to everything she has built her identity upon. That there are forms of attachment that cannot be redirected. That there are systems in which her presence, no matter how strong, no matter how precise, will always remain secondary to something that no longer exists in tangible form. This is not something she accepts easily, but it is something she cannot ignore. And once recognized, it changes the nature of every interaction that follows. Because the conflict is no longer about positioning within the system. It is about whether the system itself is worth remaining within. The moment a system reveals that it cannot be reshaped, the question shifts from strategy to endurance. Emma Frost does not arrive at this threshold impulsively. She does not react. She assesses. She recalibrates internally before any external shift becomes visible. What changes is not her understanding of Scott, nor even her understanding of the structure she occupies. What changes is her orientation toward it. Up to this point, her engagement has been driven by the assumption that persistence, clarity, and presence would eventually produce transformation. Not immediately, not without resistance, but inevitably. That belief is not naive. It is consistent with every other system she has navigated. Power, when applied with precision, tends to produce movement. Structures bend. Hierarchies adjust. Centers shift. But here, the center remains fixed. Emma begins to test a different hypothesis. If the structure cannot be altered from within, perhaps it can be destabilized through exposure. Not through confrontation, not through emotional escalation, but through the deliberate illumination of what remains unspoken. She does not force Scott to confront Jean directly. She forces him to confront the consequences of not doing so. This is where the tension sharpens into something more defined. Their interactions begin to carry a weight that was previously diffused. Conversations that once operated smoothly now reveal friction points. Moments of alignment are interrupted by subtle divergences, not in opinion, but in orientation. Emma speaks from the present. Scott responds from continuity. The difference is small. It accumulates. Emma introduces precision into these exchanges. She selects her words carefully, not to provoke, but to reveal. She highlights inconsistencies, not as accusations, but as observations that cannot be easily dismissed. She draws attention to patterns that Scott has normalized, patterns that only become visible when viewed from outside the system he inhabits. Scott does not reject these observations. He absorbs them. He considers them. But his responses remain anchored to the same internal logic. He does not deny the past. He does not minimize its influence. But he does not perceive its persistence as something that requires resolution. For him, the past is integrated. For Emma, it is unresolved. This divergence becomes the defining axis of their conflict, not because it produces immediate confrontation, but because it creates a gap that cannot be bridged through agreement alone. They are not arguing over facts. They are operating from different interpretations of what those facts mean within the present. Emma's frustration does not manifest as anger. It manifests as clarity that has nowhere to go. She sees the structure. She articulates it. She presents it in ways that are difficult to refute. And yet, the system does not reorganize in response. This is where her usual methods begin to lose effectiveness. Not because they are flawed, but because they are being applied to a structure that does not respond to the mechanisms she relies on. Influence, in this context, does not produce change. It produces awareness. And awareness, without action, reinforces the existing configuration. Scott becomes aware of the imbalance. He recognizes, on some level, that Emma is not fully integrated into his emotional framework in the way she is attempting to be. But recognition does not translate into reconfiguration. He continues to operate within the same structure, attempting to compensate for its limitations without dismantling its foundation. He offers presence. He offers attention. He offers commitment. But he does not offer displacement. Jean Grey remains where she has always been, not as an active presence, but as a fixed point that defines the shape of everything around it. Emma reaches a point where this becomes untenable, not because she lacks the capacity to endure, but because endurance begins to resemble complicity. To remain within the system without challenging its core assumptions would require her to accept a position that contradicts her fundamental sense of self. She is not peripheral. She has never been peripheral. And yet, within this structure, she is forced to occupy a position that does not reflect her actual capacity, her actual presence, her actual significance. This is where the internal fracture deepens, not as a collapse, but as a tension between two incompatible orientations. On one side, her understanding of the system, her recognition of its limits, her awareness that no amount of strategic engagement will alter its foundation. On the other, her desire for something that she cannot simply dismiss as irrational or misplaced. Because what she seeks is not control. It is recognition, not the superficial kind, not validation in the form of acknowledgement or reassurance, but the kind of recognition that reorganizes a system, that places her at the center of the relational structure, not as an addition, but as a defining element. Scott cannot provide this. Not because he is unwilling, but because his internal architecture does not allow for it. To reposition Emma in that way would require a reconfiguration of the entire system, a displacement of the foundational element that continues to define his emotional orientation. He does not perceive this as necessary. Emma perceives it as unavoidable. The tension reaches a point where it begins to alter the way she engages with him on a fundamental level. Her composure remains intact. Her clarity does not diminish. But there is a shift in how she allocates her attention, in how she invests herself within the relationship. She becomes more selective, not in what she offers, but in what she expects in return. This is not withdrawal. It is recalibration. She begins to detach from the assumption that the system will eventually align with her presence. She stops testing its limits, because those limits have already been revealed. What remains is a decision, not an immediate one, not a dramatic one, but a gradual reorientation toward a different understanding of what this relationship represents. Not as a space to be transformed, but as a space to be evaluated. Emma Frost does not operate within systems indefinitely when those systems fail to recognize her on her own terms. But she also does not abandon them without fully understanding the implications of doing so. This is where the conflict becomes fully internal, not as a question of whether Scott values her or whether their connection has substance, but as a question of whether that substance is sufficient in the absence of structural recognition. She knows what she is capable of receiving. She knows what she is capable of giving. And for the first time, those two realities do not align within the same system. This is not a failure of the relationship. It is a revelation of its limits. And once those limits are understood, the next stage becomes inevitable. Not because of what Emma does, but because of what she can no longer ignore. The final stage of structural tension does not announce itself as a rupture. It arrives as inevitability. By the time Emma Frost reaches it, the conflict has already completed its internal formation. Every variable has been tested, every angle examined, every possible recalibration attempted. What remains is not uncertainty. It is clarity that has hardened into conclusion. The system has revealed its limits, and Emma can no longer pretend those limits are temporary. This is where her dynamic with Scott shifts in a way that is subtle on the surface, but decisive beneath it. There is no dramatic withdrawal, no overt rejection, no collapse of interaction. The relationship continues to function. They continue to operate together, to engage, to share space and responsibility. But the underlying orientation has changed. Emma is no longer trying to become central. She is observing the consequences of not being. This shift introduces a different kind of tension, one that does not seek resolution, but exposes the absence of it. Her presence becomes more precise, more intentional, less invested in shaping the structure, and more focused on revealing its contours as they are. She stops negotiating with the system. She begins to measure it. Scott senses this, though not immediately in its full significance. He recognizes the change in her engagement, the subtle withdrawal of expectation, the absence of the quiet pressure that had previously defined their interactions. On the surface, this appears as stability, as ease, as a reduction of friction. But stability, in this case, is not resolution. It is distance. Emma's clarity has reached a point where it no longer needs to assert itself. She no longer needs to introduce moments of exposure, to highlight inconsistencies, to create conditions that force recognition. The structure has already revealed itself fully. What she now confronts is not whether the system can change. It is whether she is willing to remain within it as it is. This is where the conflict reaches its most critical phase, not in external action, but in internal alignment. Emma Frost has built her identity around autonomy, around the refusal to occupy spaces that diminish her presence or reduce her to something secondary. She does not define herself through others. She does not derive her value from recognition that is conditional or incomplete. And yet, here she is, within a system that does not fully recognize her, attached to a person whose internal architecture prevents him from reorganizing around her in the way she understands is necessary. This is not a contradiction she can sustain indefinitely. The moment of articulation arrives not as a declaration, but as a fracture made visible through language. A remark precise and controlled, but carrying the full weight of everything that has been observed, measured, and internalized. It is not an accusation. It is a statement of fact. Emma gives voice to the imbalance, not in an attempt to provoke change, but to acknowledge its permanence. She does not need Scott to respond. She does not expect him to resolve it. The act of articulation is not a strategy. It is a recognition made external. In that moment, the structure is no longer implicit. It is named, and once named, it cannot return to invisibility. Scott is confronted with something he has not been forced to fully articulate before. Not because he was unaware, but because awareness had never required explicit confrontation. The system had functioned without needing to be examined at this level of precision. Now it does not. The presence of Jean Grey, as a defining element within his emotional architecture, is no longer something that exists beneath the surface. It is acknowledged not as memory, not as nostalgia, but as an active force shaping his current relationships. Scott does not deny this, but he does not dismantle it either. His response, consistent with everything that has defined him up to this point, is to maintain coherence, to hold both realities simultaneously, to acknowledge Emma's position without displacing the structure that prevents her from fully occupying it. From his perspective, this is integrity. From Emma's perspective, it is confirmation. The system will not change. This realization does not produce immediate separation. Emma does not leave in that moment. She does not disengage dramatically. What changes is more subtle but more definitive. She stops investing in the possibility of transformation. This is the point of no return. Because once the expectation of change is removed, what remains is the system in its actual form, without projection, without assumption, without the possibility of future alignment compensating for present imbalance. Emma now sees the relationship exactly as it is, and that clarity reshapes everything. Her interactions with Scott become more contained, not in the sense of emotional withdrawal, but in the precision of her engagement. She gives what she chooses to give, without the underlying assumption that it will lead to something beyond what is already present. She does not attempt to deepen the structure. She operates within its limits. This is not resignation. It is sovereignty. Scott, in turn, begins to experience the consequences of this shift, though not in a way that immediately translates into action. The dynamic that once carried tension now carries absence. The subtle pressure that Emma applied, the expectation of movement, of reconfiguration, of deeper alignment, is gone. What replaces it is something quieter, more distant, more final. He senses that something has changed, but the nature of that change is not immediately accessible to him. From his perspective, the relationship still exists. The connection is still there. The shared history, the shared responsibilities, the mutual understanding all remain intact. But something essential has been removed, not from the structure itself, but from Emma's investment in it. This is where the full consequence of the conflict becomes visible. Not as a dramatic collapse, but as a redefinition of what the relationship can and cannot be. Emma Frost does not need to leave for the system to lose its capacity to evolve. She only needs to stop trying to change it. And once that happens, the system stabilizes in its final form. Scott remains anchored to Jean Grey, not in a way that prevents him from forming other connections, but in a way that defines the limits of those connections. Emma remains within the structure, but no longer seeks to occupy its center. The tension does not disappear. It crystallizes. What began as misalignment has become definition. What was once a question of possibility is now a statement of reality. The system has revealed itself completely, and in doing so has removed any ambiguity about what it can sustain. This is not resolution. It is fixation. And in that fixation, both characters are forced to confront something that extends beyond the relationship itself. For Scott, the question becomes whether continuity is the same as loyalty, or whether it is a form of inertia that prevents transformation. For Emma, the question becomes whether clarity is enough to justify remaining within a system that cannot fully recognize her. Neither question is answered. They are simply left in place. And that is what gives the conflict its final shape. What unfolds between Scott Summers and Emma Frost does not remain confined to their private dynamic. It extends outward, shaping the way audiences interpret not only these characters, but the broader symbolic language through which relationships, memory, and identity are understood within contemporary myth. Their conflict becomes more than narrative tension. It becomes a pattern that audiences recognize, often without consciously articulating it. At its core, this dynamic exposes a fundamental asymmetry in how presence and absence are valued. Emma is visible, active, evolving. Jean is absent, but fixed. And yet, the absence carries more structural weight than the presence. This inversion disrupts intuitive expectations. It suggests that what is no longer there can exert more influence than what is directly in front of us, not because it is inherently more powerful, but because it has been preserved in a form that resists change. This has significant implications for how audiences engage with the narrative. Identification does not occur evenly. It organizes itself along lines of projection. Some align with Scott, perceiving his continuity as loyalty, as emotional integrity, as a refusal to discard what once defined him. Others align with Emma, recognizing in her position a form of invisibility that is not caused by lack of presence, but by structural displacement. This division does not produce simple disagreement. It produces polarization. Each position reflects a different interpretation of what constitutes emotional truth. For one, truth lies in consistency, in the preservation of bonds that shaped identity. For the other, truth lies in recognition, in the ability to fully engage with what exists in the present without being constrained by prior configurations. The narrative does not resolve this tension. It amplifies it. In doing so, it transforms the relationship into a symbolic arena where broader cultural anxieties are played out. The question of whether one can truly move forward without dismantling the past becomes central. Not in an abstract sense, but in a deeply embodied one, where characters are forced to navigate the consequences of carrying unresolved structures into new configurations. Emma Frost, within this context, becomes a figure of contested visibility. She embodies the experience of entering a system that appears open, but is in fact already organized around a prior center. Her struggle is not for access, but for redefinition. She is not excluded. She is included without being central. This distinction resonates beyond the narrative itself. It reflects broader patterns in how individuals and groups experience integration into established systems. The idea that one can be present, competent, even essential, and still remain peripheral to the core structure of recognition is not confined to fiction. It is a recurring condition in social, cultural, and institutional environments. Emma's response to this condition is equally significant. She does not collapse into insecurity. She does not seek validation through submission. Instead, she confronts the limits of the system with clarity, refusing to distort her own perception in order to maintain alignment with something that does not fully recognize her. This positions her not as a victim, but as a diagnostic force within the narrative. Through her, the structure reveals itself. The imbalance becomes visible. The assumptions that govern the system are exposed, not through overt critique, but through the friction generated by her presence within it. Scott Summers, on the other hand, embodies a different aspect of this dynamic. He represents the stability of inherited structures, the persistence of configurations that continue to organize behavior long after their original context has disappeared. His attachment to Jean Grey is not presented as weakness, but as continuity, as a form of internal coherence that resists fragmentation. This creates a complex symbolic interplay. Scott is not positioned as antagonist. He is not actively denying Emma recognition. He is operating within a system that he does not perceive as problematic because it has always functioned in this way. His inability to reconfigure is not a refusal. It is a limitation embedded within the very structure that defines him. This is where the narrative achieves a particular kind of depth. It avoids reducing the conflict to moral opposition. There is no clear right or wrong. There is no singular perspective that resolves the tension. Instead, the story presents a system in which both positions are internally consistent, yet incompatible when placed in direct relation to one another. The audience is left to navigate this incompatibility, to project their own frameworks onto the characters, to interpret the conflict through the lens of their own experiences with attachment, recognition, and identity. This is further intensified by the way the narrative is mediated. The medium itself shapes perception. Repetition across different storylines, reinterpretations across different writers, variations in tone and emphasis, all contribute to the amplification of certain elements while muting others. The conflict is not static. It is rearticulated over time, each iteration reinforcing its symbolic significance. Jean Grey's role within this dynamic becomes increasingly abstract. She is less a character and more a reference point, a symbolic anchor that persists across narrative variations. Her presence is not dependent on active participation. It is sustained through the consistency of her position within Scott's internal structure. This transforms her into a kind of mythic constant, an ideal that is preserved through absence. She is not subjected to the same processes of change, contradiction, and reinterpretation that affect active characters. As a result, she becomes resistant to the kinds of critique that Emma, as an active participant, cannot avoid. Emma, by contrast, remains exposed. She evolves. She contradicts herself. She adapts. She engages with the present in ways that necessarily involve risk, friction, and the possibility of failure. This makes her more complex, more dynamic, but also more vulnerable to reinterpretation and critique. The asymmetry between them is not just narrative. It is structural. This asymmetry feeds into broader cultural patterns of idealization and comparison. The tendency to elevate what is no longer present into an untouchable standard, while subjecting what is present to constant evaluation, is not unique to this narrative. It reflects a wider psychological tendency to stabilize identity through fixed reference points, even when those reference points no longer correspond to current reality. In this sense, the conflict between Emma and the memory of Jean is not just about Scott's inability to move on. It is about the difficulty of competing with something that has been removed from the conditions that produce change. It is about the impossibility of surpassing an ideal that cannot be challenged because it no longer exists in a form that can be tested. This dynamic resonates with audiences because it mirrors real experiences of comparison, of feeling measured against standards that are not subject to the same conditions of evaluation. It taps into the frustration of being present in a system that continues to orient itself around something that is no longer there, but still defines what is valued. The narrative does not resolve this. It sustains it, and in sustaining it, it transforms the relationship into something more than a subplot. It becomes a symbolic structure through which audiences can explore questions of identity, attachment, and recognition without the need for explicit articulation. The conflict persists because it cannot be resolved without dismantling the very structures that give it meaning. And those structures extend far beyond the characters themselves. What remains after the conflict between Scott Summers and Emma Frost is not resolution, but configuration. The system does not collapse. It stabilizes, not in equilibrium, but in definition. Every variable has settled into its position, not because the tension has been resolved, but because it has been fully expressed. There is no longer ambiguity about what the structure can sustain. Scott remains anchored. That is the constant. His orientation does not shift in the way Emma once tested for. The presence of Jean Grey continues to function as a fixed point within his internal landscape, not as an active force, but as a reference that organizes meaning. This does not prevent him from forming connections, from engaging, from committing. But it defines the limits of those engagements in ways that are subtle, yet decisive. He carries continuity as a form of identity, and continuity, once crystallized, resists transformation. Emma Frost, in contrast, does not remain fixed in the same way. Her response to the system is not to adapt indefinitely, but to extract clarity from it. She leaves the structure, whether physically or psychologically, with a refined understanding of what it represents and what it cannot provide. This does not diminish her. It sharpens her. It removes the ambiguity that once allowed her to invest in the possibility of something beyond what was structurally available. She does not carry the relationship as unresolved tension. She carries it as knowledge. That distinction defines her trajectory after the conflict. Emma does not become more guarded in a simplistic sense. She becomes more precise, more exacting in how she evaluates the systems she enters, more attentive to the underlying structures that determine whether her presence will be recognized on her own terms or filtered through prior configurations that she cannot displace. What she encountered with Scott does not weaken her capacity for connection. It recalibrates it. Scott, however, does not undergo the same form of recalibration. His trajectory is not defined by a shift in self-perception, but by the reinforcement of an existing structure. The conflict does not introduce doubt into his framework. It reveals its limits, but those limits are not perceived by him as deficiencies. They are perceived as consistency, as adherence to a form of internal coherence that he values above flexibility. This creates a divergence in legacy. Emma moves forward with increased clarity. Scott remains within continuity. Neither position is framed as failure, but their asymmetry becomes the defining feature of what remains after the relationship has reached its structural conclusion. The absence of resolution is what gives this dynamic its enduring power. There is no moment where the system corrects itself, no point at which the imbalance is addressed in a way that satisfies both perspectives. Instead, the conflict persists as a fixed configuration, a pattern that can be revisited, reinterpreted, but not fully dissolved. This persistence transforms the relationship into a symbolic reference point within the broader narrative universe. It becomes a lens through which other dynamics are understood, a template that informs how audiences interpret similar tensions in different contexts. The idea that presence does not guarantee centrality, that understanding does not guarantee transformation, that clarity does not always lead to change, becomes embedded in the way the story is remembered. Emma Frost's role within this legacy is particularly significant. She represents the moment where a system is fully understood and still found insufficient. Not because of lack of effort, not because of misinterpretation, but because the structure itself does not allow for the outcome that is being sought. Her departure, whether literal or conceptual, does not function as an escape. It functions as a boundary, a refusal to remain within a configuration that cannot accommodate her without diminishing her position within it. This boundary is not reactive. It is deliberate. It is the result of sustained observation, of engagement that has reached its limit, of clarity that no longer permits negotiation with something that has already revealed its constraints. Scott's role, in turn, becomes emblematic of a different kind of boundary, one that is not actively drawn, but inherently present. His inability to reorganize around Emma is not framed as a conscious refusal. It is a structural condition, a boundary that exists within him, shaping his capacity for transformation without being explicitly acknowledged as such. This creates a lasting tension in how the narrative is interpreted. Scott is not positioned as someone who failed Emma. Emma is not positioned as someone who could not reach Scott. Instead, the relationship is framed as a convergence of two coherent systems that cannot fully integrate without compromising their fundamental structures. This framing resists simplification. It does not allow for moral resolution, and that is precisely what ensures its longevity. The conflict does not end because it cannot end within the parameters that define it. It becomes part of the narrative's foundation, a fixed element that continues to influence how characters are perceived, how relationships are evaluated, how emotional structures are understood within the context of the story. Over time, this dynamic accumulates symbolic weight. It is referenced implicitly in other relationships. echoed in variations of similar tensions, reinforced through repetition and reinterpretation. The specific details may shift, but the underlying pattern remains recognizable. A system organized around absence, a presence that cannot displace it, a recognition that does not translate into reconfiguration. This pattern extends beyond the narrative itself. It reflects a broader psychological reality, one in which individuals carry prior structures into new configurations, often without fully recognizing the extent to which those structures define their capacity for change. The difficulty of competing with what has been preserved, the frustration of being measured against standards that are not subject to present conditions, the realization that understanding does not always grant control, all of these elements resonate beyond fiction. Emma Frost and Scott Summers become, in this sense, more than characters. They become symbolic positions within a recurring dynamic, one that continues to surface in different forms across different contexts, because it is rooted in something fundamental about how identity, attachment, and recognition are structured. The legacy of their conflict is not a lesson. It is a pattern, and patterns do not resolve. They persist.